Your ears do not deceive you. You have just entered the Cryptid Creator Corner brought to you by your friends at Comic Book Yeti. So without further ado, let's get on to the interview.
Y'all, Jimmy, the Chaos Goblin, strikes again. I should have known better than to mention I was working on my DC Universe meets Ravenloft hybrid D&D campaign on social media. My bad. He goes and tags a bunch of comics creators we know, and now I have to get it in gear and whip this campaign into shape so we can start playing. Another friend chimes in, "Are you going to make maps?" It's fair to say it's been a while since I put something together, so I guess, question mark? It was then that I discovered Arkenforge. If you don't know who Arkenforge is, they have everything you need to make your TTRPG more fun and immersive, allowing you to build, play, and export animated maps, including in-person fog of war capability that lets your players interact with maps as the adventure unfolds while you, the DM, get the full picture. Now I'm set to easily build high-res animated maps, saving myself precious time and significantly adding nuance to our campaign. That's a win every day in my book. Check them out at arkenforge.com and use the discount code YETI5 to get $5 off. I'll drop a link in the show notes for you, and big thanks to Arkenforge for partnering with our show. I think I'm going to make Jimmy play a Goblin Warlock just to get even. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cryptid Creator Corner. I'm Byron O'Neill, your host today, and I'm joined by a guest doing the double as a returning guest on the show. She is an Eisner nominee, a Ringo winner, and a New York Times bestselling cartoonist. And my wife could care less generally about comics, but she knows who she is because, of course, it has pockets. So, Sarah Andersen, welcome back. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Trying to enjoy the last bit of summer here. It's starting to feel a little bit like fall. So
Yeah.
I'm happy. Fall's my favorite season, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. I love it when like the spooky vibes slowly start to enter and you're like, yes, it's coming.
Yes, exactly. Planning out my October watch list. My son is a teenager, and he now has an interest in creature feature horror
Okay.
movies, which kind of
Okay.
is the pocket that I love. So starting to make a list, and hopefully we'll get to watch a few
Okay,
during the
that's
October
awesome.
season.
Those are the older ones, right? The lagoon creature. I'm
Oh, well,
blanking on his
just
name.
any creature feature. Like
Okay.
I just love monster movies. Like
Uh-huh.
I don't know what it is. Like as I've gotten older and I guess become a dad, the slasher genre
Mhm.
and the dystopian kind of horror stuff, even the like body horror stuff doesn't appeal to me as much in terms of film, but
Mhm.
I love monster movies and I always will. So he's gotten into Godzilla, and so that's kind of I guess was the gateway for looking at other things and hey, what do we want to watch? So yeah.
Yeah, I totally feel you. I feel like when you start to get into horror or scary movies, you just watch everything. And
Yeah.
I'm kind of the same way now too, where I'm like, I'm not really interested in like a dark serial killer movie. I'd rather see something that has something fresh and new in it.
Yeah. Well, vampires never tire. That's my
Yeah.
thing. I could watch any vampire movie, but
Oh yeah, me too.
yeah. Well, it's been a big week for you.
Yeah.
As I see that the copyright infringement case you're a part of is greenlit to proceed, so that's exciting. Like you and 9 other plaintiffs, as I understand this, have an ongoing lawsuit against Stable Diffusion that also includes Stability AI, Midjourney, DeviantArt, and Runway AI. Could
That's
you
right.
give me a little background on kind of how this whole thing came about, and for the listeners, and where we're at with things?
Sure. So it's a very complicated issue, but basically, we filed the lawsuit because in order for these generative AI systems to work, they need huge swaths of data. And in that data is our copyrighted work. And we did not consent to that. And I have many reasons why, but I did want to mention that more recently, there's been a lot of reporting about how much generative AI causes emissions, and so it's pretty terrible for the environment. And I don't want my work to be used for that. I mean, that's sort of a side note to the many other reasons, but basically, it's a copyright case, and we officially are moving forward into a phase called discovery, where we will be requesting documents for each other. So it's a very important phase because it's information gathering. And we had good news. Basically, all of our copyright claims were able to move forward. It was trimmed down a bit. I still haven't had a chance to really go through everything, but I believe like DMCA was cut. But the heart of our argument is there and it's going forward, and it's a really big deal. And we were very, very happy with the ruling.
Yeah, it's incredible. I've been trying to educate myself so I can speak more intelligently on the topic of generative AI, which I openly admit I absolutely loathe. But it's
Mhm.
unacceptable to me to be ignorant about it. And in the most recent rabbit trail, after reading through the court documents on this case, led to researching about. Hopefully, I'm getting the acronym right. Is LANION? I guess is that the
Mhm.
short? Yeah,
Mhm.
and those are the training sets, or short for large scale artificial intelligence open network. That's a mouthful, specifically the Lanayam B set, and the sheer scale of this technology and how it's been invested in and ratcheted up is just mind-boggling to me. It's as if these folks have never seen Terminator. Um, the data sets were first released in August of 2021, where the figure I read said that they had used 400 million image caption pairs, and the B version launched in March of 22 has 5.85 billion. That's with a B.
Yeah.
So the artistic community is reeling, and I'm admittedly feeling a little bit overwhelmed myself. All this fighting, for what I firmly believe in theft. In now we're in the courts, and it just feels like it hasn't diminished or dissuaded the progression of it at all.
Yeah.
These numbers, are just staggering. So please tell me you're a little bit more optimistic about it than I am at this point.
Yeah, I am optimistic. And
Good.
something to consider is that these cases take a really long time. So establishing precedent is a lengthy process. So I think that's why you see, especially for an issue that doesn't have any existing precedent. So that's why I think you see these AI companies running forward, is because they're sort of using this gray area time to do what they want. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people working on setting limitations.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately just a slow process, and we didn't really have a lot to stop them or strike them down immediately. It's something that has to be decided in the courts. But I personally am optimistic, and not just in legal terms, but also just in the sentiment that I see. I've seen a major shift, and I think at the beginning it was very novel, and it was a lot about art. And so artists were very concerned. But I think people are starting to realize more and more that it's not just about art, it's also their data. And they've seen the way that AI has started to infiltrate society in ways that aren't so positive. People have seen deep fakes and fake news and all kinds of negative things, and it's now kind of commonplace. And I've seen a growing backlash. So, like I said, I think it's a slow process, but I really am optimistic, and I'm very happy with the recent ruling.
Yeah, it was a little bit scary for me when I dove into it. Just that feeling of a lack of safeguards. I read that the Stanford Internet Observatory found over 1,000 validated links in the data set that reference child sexual abuse materials, and
Yeah,
it just broke my heart. Right, that
yeah,
they're using it for that purpose. But
yeah.
I recently read a piece that interviewed you that you were talking specifically about Meta's AI training and
hmm
calling choice an illusion.
hmm
What's your opinion on the best way creatives can protect themselves online?
Yeah. So while we're working on making it impossible, that is my hope, for AI companies to just scrape and use our work without consent. Um, we unfortunately don't have a clear answer on that yet. So, what I would say is that artists should use Glaze and Nightshade, and they're two different programs. I'm not sure if they call them programs, but um, that sort of mask and distort your work to generative AI. And Nightshade actually poisons the data set. So I unfortunately I don't use it all the time because it's not as strong with very simple styles, but it works for like 95% of art. And I highly suggest you use it. And it just has a very, very subtle, like glowy filter effect. It's barely noticeable.
Yeah.
And it really works. And I would recommend that all artists use it.
Oh, yeah. I'll check that out and definitely put links in the show notes because I was
Yeah.
unfamiliar with those. I mean, it makes perfect sense if it adds a bit of a blur because most of those generative AI programs are using a Gaussian blur
Yeah.
anyway, as I understand it with it. So I could see how that messes things up.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to devolve this completely in the interview focused on AI. Thank you for fighting the good fight. Lord knows that somebody must. Um, Please, if you're listening to as an artist or a creative, make sure you register your work with the Copyright Office. It seems seriously archaic, I know at this point, but at least it gives you some groundwork for fighting and protecting yourself. How much is debatable, but I would argue that it's worth it. But on a cheery note, I guess the next obvious question would be before we jump into the book, how is all this affecting your work?
um, it depends, with a case like this, sometimes there will be huge lulls while it's being um, while the lawyers are working on it and I don't have anything to do. And then at times it's like a second job. So I've definitely felt an impact. Like I had a recent sort of low with my comics where I just wasn't writing well. That usually happens when I'm overwhelmed. That's something I've
Yeah,
learned as I've gotten older is that art blocks don't just kind of happen. There's usually an emotional component to it. And I think sometimes the pessimism kind of seeps into my writing, or not. Well, I don't want to say pessimism because I actually am optimistic about how things will turn out. But I think just the weight of everything that's happening, not just with AI, but also in the world, definitely has an effect on my writing. And I'm sort of out of that low now. But it's like artists can't exist in the world and just tune it out and focus on their work because it's such an emotional process. So they sort of play into each other. So
yeah.
I definitely notice. I noticed some like darker moods affecting how I write, and that's unfortunately just part of it for me.
All right, let's take a quick break. Hey, comics fam. Indie comic book publisher Band of Bars just got a level up and announced it is now a cooperative. This heralds a new era for them, including a partnership with Dauntless Stories. And they added several new members to the ownership group. Marcus Jimenez is now Chief Operating Officer, Brent Fisher takes on the role of Chief Diversity Officer, and Joey Galvez is introduced as Head of Kickstarter Ops and Social Media Manager, which is sure to increase their capabilities overall as a publisher. And it further promotes their mission statement of advancing representation, inclusion, and diversity in the medium. They also established a new board of directors to help chart the new path of their journey. With new projects in the works like Alas Goodbye dropping in June, Unbroken soon launching on Kickstarter, and Pawn coming up with Dauntless, stay tuned to this space for more exciting news from the growing Bards family. Let's get back to the show. What have you found that helps you kind of reset yourself and kind of
Mhm.
focus on making people laugh, which is what you're known for?
Yeah. Taking a break. I used to think you just had to work through art blocks. And
Okay.
now I'm like, it's the complete opposite. You just have to stop and breathe and let that burnout kind of burn itself out and then come back. And for me, it's also sort of refocusing and writing about what I love. So I recently had a comic do well, and it was about eldritch monsters, which of course it was.
Yeah.
And, like when I sort of refocus myself and think about what do I love to write about? Who do I love to write about? I often find myself back in kind of like a spookier place.
Yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. I was reading too about how you started embracing yoga and meditation. I've been on
Yeah.
a personal streak of meditating at least 15 minutes every day since September 8th of last year, which is really
Wow.
great. Yeah, it's been a big help. What's your routine look like? What have you found?
Yeah, so I used to do a little bit every day, and now I go to like a class 3 times
Okay.
a week, which to me is, if you knew me sort of before I did this, is shocking and incredible that I would do this because I used to be a person who like did not work out or take care of myself at all. And that was something I actually learned during the pandemic because I had all this time and I started noticing more things about myself and noticing that drawing for every day over a decade was starting to wear on my body. And yeah, I started like 4 years ago now, and it's like a crucial cornerstone of my life for my own health. So I think there's kind of this like stereotype that I very much embodied about artists, that they are not taking care of themselves. And I understand, it's like you don't need to become like a 10K runner
Yeah.
overnight. You don't need to become like a fitness influencer, but like start with a little bit. Like in the pandemic, I did 10 minutes of yoga per day. And now I'm able to do like an hour class.
Okay.
So yeah, highly encourage artists to take care of themselves a little bit.
I would love to get back into a yoga class. When we were in Washington, I started going. A friend invited me, and I had all these expectations of what a yoga class is going to look like. Oh, I'm going to be out of shape. Everybody there is going to be like younger and be able to do all these things that I can't. And I show up, and I think the next closest person to me was a good 15 years older, and that was the
Mhm.
friend that invited me. So there's all these old people at the Y doing yoga, and then immediately it was great, and I felt like, oh, I'm good. This
Yeah.
works, no problem. So
Right. Like I think there's kind of a stereotype about who does yoga and how they do yoga. But the class I go to is kind of the same. Like, of course, there's people that are incredible and are doing splits and all kinds of things, but most of the class are people that are sort of somewhere in between, and it's a very diverse group. So um yeah, if people are interested in getting into yoga, I think what those classes look like might not be exactly what you have in your head. I think yoga
yeah.
has like an image lately.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, switching gears, you have a new
Mhm.
book coming out.
Yeah.
Yay!
Mhm.
Yeah, so this is volume 5 of Collected Sarah Scribbles. Adulthood is a gift. There are
Mhm.
100 or so illustrations and 15 essays in the project. I get a chance to read through the advance you sent me, and these essays, although fairly short, are really amazing. I want to start with a transition here though, because we've gone from adulthood is a myth in volume 1 to adulthood is a gift in volume 5. The first volume was 2016 and this will be late 2024. What changed as you've transitioned to like suggesting age, aging was fake news
Mhm.
to embracing the inevitable passage of time as a place to discover joy?
Yeah, I mean, you said it, I think, almost better than I could. But
Okay.
the truth is that I've really grown up over the past decade or so, and the whole book is sort of a reflection on that. And I still sort of believe in this adulthood as a myth idea, because as I've gotten older, the things I expected didn't necessarily happen or pan out, but in a good way. Like I've
Yeah.
really come to embrace being a real adult. And the book is basically about how I came to be that. And it's a celebration of that sometimes awkward, sometimes painful journey, but it's also yeah, it's joyful.
Yeah, I found there's different phases and passages of life as I get older. You gain the wisdom and you care less about physically how you look. At least that's me. You just very comfortable with yourself. So when you were putting this book together, was the intention to try to encapsulate these different phases of your life, or is kind of the through line just a natural effect because it's such a personal chronology for you?
I think it's sort of a natural effect. I flipped through the book again the other day, and I remember writing some of the comics and essays, and I can really see that exact point in time. And I was really writing my true feelings about being at that point. So there was a there was like a phase I went through writing wise when I think I was like 28 or 29, where I was writing like geriatric millennials versus young, condescending Gen Z.
Yeah.
And it was funny because at that moment, Gen Z was having its rise and its moment. And I was feeling that and trying to reflect on that in like a positive and humorous way. So I feel like there are so many little snapshots of the journey upwards towards adulthood. And yeah, it was fun to look back and sort of remember where I was at in those moments.
Yeah, one recent piece made me cackle when you were covering the latest TikTok dance trend. I know TikTok makes me feel old, but I'm close to 2 decades older than you are, which absolutely pains me to say. Do you ever try to embrace the slang in your work? I know bet, glow up, and chuggy like sound great rolling off the tongue, but I know I'm cool. I'm not. I'm cool for a Gen Xer though, and I'll happily stay in my lane.
Oh yeah, I definitely, I think if I tried to sort of fake being a hip Gen Zer, they would smell it immediately. I don't think, unless a word felt natural to me, I don't think it would make its way in there. Also, my audience is so like definitely millennial. When I see my insights, the age group is always exactly the same. Like Gen Z never really came on the ride with me.
Yeah.
So they would know. They would know, everyone would know and be like, no, ma'am, please stay in your
Oh,
lane.
you pulled out the ma'am. Have you gotten ma'amed now? That's
I don't know. I haven't really taken notice of that. Now I'm gonna see next time I get mammed, I'm gonna be like,
I get sirred so many times. I'm just like, oh no, I'm that old. It's awful. Well, was
but
there
it's
a point?
also a sign of respect,
Yeah,
to be fair.
I guess like okay, you've made it this far, old guy. You're still around.
You have made it this far.
Yeah. Well, yes, yes, it's better than the alternative. Was
Right.
it was there a point in time where examining those generational differences just seemed specifically appealing, or was it as simple as you're looking out there and you feel lost on TikTok, right?
Yeah, I think it was that my work had been branded so clearly as the millennial girl comics. Like I
Sure.
remember media and I believe even my publisher, it was always like, these are comics for millennials. So I was always very aware of the fact that to other people, my writing really reflected this generation. And so for most of my 20s, it felt like I was getting talked slash written about very much in that way, and that was my identity. And then when this other generation started to rise, I was like, how do I like how do I deal with this? How do I write about the fact that the millennial generation is now no longer the youngest and not being nitpicked as much anymore? But yeah, it was so core to my brand and identity that I think I couldn't help but contemplate that a lot.
As you've now said rise twice, so I feel
Yeah.
like it's almost like a horror movie, the rise
The
of
rise.
Gen Z.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how much of the specific project was produced during the COVID lockdown? I'm curious how much of an imprint that had.
I think a lot of it will be, I think, the later days of the COVID lockdown. I had a book come out during lockdown, I think 2021, that had a lot of sort of the early days in it. So there's definitely some some comics that were made in the full blown lockdown days of the pandemic in there, but yeah, I would say maybe half and half. It's also sort of comics I was writing when we were moving out of
Okay.
the more lockdown era.
Okay. Was the COVID stuff a little bit more of the Cryptid Club? I mean, I could see how isolation and some of those things were played with the monsters and
Yeah, totally. I believe all of Cryptid Club was written during the serious lockdown days. I'm trying to remember because I remember I was doing line work and flats and color sort of right. We were still wearing masks, but we were going out a bit. So I basically used the pandemic to write Cryptid Club, which, like you said, is very appropriate because it is
yeah.
about isolated monsters.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it was very interesting time for all of us, with self-analysis and evaluation, all these things of getting inside yourself and staring at at who we are. So, how do you feel like it changed you and kind of thusly Sarah Scribbles, kind of moving out of it?
Yeah. I mean, I understand that what I'm about to say comes from a very privileged perspective, but I learned so much about myself and my needs during the pandemic because
Okay.
when we were talking about yoga earlier, before the pandemic, I had always been in this really intense cycle of making a book and then touring it for a long time and doing Comic Con. So I was going from place to place a lot and I hadn't really sat still. But I'm so introverted that sitting still is usually a good and productive thing for me, even over long periods of time. So it really was a big moment of change for me. It was, I think, the first time where I really learned how to take care of myself and to cook. And maybe I was definitely behind on that, being like 28, 29. But it gave me the space to reflect and learn those things about myself and what I needed. But I also understand, that that was a very dark time for a lot of people, and that's sort of the best case scenario. I was in a comfortable apartment. I was safe.
Yeah.
I didn't get I didn't get COVID until people stopped wearing masks outside. So I was very fortunate.
Well, you recently talked about a transition from a focus on internal turmoil to being more present in the outside world, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of a natural extension of this coming out of COVID. As Sarah Scribbles is so autobiographical, would we see the imprint and the impact in this book specifically?
Yeah, I was 19 when I started Sarah Scribbles, and you can see a lot of confusion and cynicism, self-criticism in the early comics. And
Yeah.
I was really trying to work out my place in the world, and internally. And you see that the first, I think, half of Sarah Scribbles is really just all about me and my emotions. And as I've kind of grown up, I've noticed I'm less interested in that and more interested in reflecting things that I love, or mythology, or things I read and see around me. And you see a lot of that in later Sarah Scribbles and in this book. Like, you see more characters, you see Dracula, you see biblically accurate angels. And that's sort of me leaning into the things I'm interested in that are more external. And I think it's a sort of a shift from writing about myself, which I know, to writing about my interests in the outside world, which I love. So write what you know to write what you love.
Yeah, it's got to be weird because for someone self-described as an introvert and with, some social anxiety, then as you're coming out of this, you're finding your legs with this, you're transitioning, you find yourself in the middle of these big culture wars, right?
Yeah.
So there's the AI bit and the alt-right
Mhm.
manipulating your stuff. A fair bit of the focus of the 15 essays in the book is it's introspective. It's looking backwards. Has
Mhm.
that been a cathartic process to write them and something you found that gives you a bit of a release, having been wrapped up in these things you never asked to be wrapped up in
Yeah.
and probably never would have seen impacting your life?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you see a lot of breaking of naivety in some of the essays and some of the things I have seen and experienced as a cartoonist. Because when I started, I was just 19, and I was so just so naive. And I didn't, I think feminism wasn't discussed as much as it is today back then. Like, I didn't have a good understanding even of what feminism was when I started the comic. And then I sort of kept bumping into things and running into things, and things would happen on the news, and it forced me to reckon with that. And I feel like I have a much more well-rounded view of the world and what it means to actually be a good person and to be responsible. And I think you see that in some of the essays, and just reflecting on some dark truths that I've unfortunately uncovered in my time as a cartoonist. And, what I will say is, although it was challenging, I'm really grateful for a lot of those lessons, because I feel like it has made it has made it easier for me to make decisions, like joining the lawsuit. It has made it easier for me to make those choices with, maybe I'm like doubting myself up a bit, but with grace and conviction, you know, um, having a full understanding of why I do something. And yeah, I sort of understand my place and my role in the world, a bit better now. Although I won't say I'm perfect. I still sort of have a tough time navigating, like, what does it mean to have a big platform and what sort of things I write about. And definitely not perfect. And still, I sort of am constantly thinking about how to how to be responsible with my platform.
So do you ever feel sort of trapped in a representational box? By that,
Mhm.
I mean you're the millennial cartoonist, and the feminism for millennials looks very different than feminism in Gen Z.
Yeah,
These social concepts, and as they morph and they march on, and the view on them changes. So,
yeah.
do you ever is that ever a conflict, an internal conflict on representing your brand over yourself?
That's an interesting question. I think when I think about those issues, I have a bit more humility now, and I think that might come off as that I'm being too quiet, but I often feel like I've seen so many things and so many changes that I feel like I don't necessarily have all the answers. So I've become more of a listener, and when I do take action, I try to do so responsibly and with something that I feel will have tangible impact, as opposed to um, this isn't the case for other people, but for me, sometimes just reacting to something might be just out of ego because I want people to know I have a certain stance or something. So
Yeah.
I've gotten a bit slower and quieter with how I do things because, like I said, I don't feel like I have all the answers, and I feel like I need to be a lot more thoughtful about things these days and not so reactive. And that isn't to say that people who are more like consistently outspoken, I think that's amazing. It's just um I've shifted modes a bit.
Well, yeah, it's a little harder when you have the fan base that you do to then delete that Twitter X post that you regret. I know
Right.
I've deleted a few. I was like, nope, nope, I do not need to wade in these waters. That this is not
Right.
good for me. So,
Right. And the internet is very reactive, and I just I maybe I'm repeating myself a bit, but I really do want to be responsible and do things in a way that to me um feel like they will have the impact that I want it to have without causing a like a Twitter meltdown. It's gotten a bit I feel like it's gotten a bit harder to navigate as things have gotten a bit more reactive, and I understand why, because we live in times that are so challenging, and it's such a time of upheaval and threatening for many groups of people. So I understand, but I also try to navigate that very carefully.
well, I'm curious about your relationship kind of to your medium, which to me isn't just, the cartoons themselves, but it has always been social media and that feedback loop. It's gotten increasingly toxic lately, and a fair number of comics community pros I know personally just have left that world entirely.
Mhm.
You know, in the beginning, that feedback loop got you into the wider world, and the exposure that seemed pivotal to you finding your voice as a young artist. So how has your relationship to it changed?
Yeah, it's a great question because I have two very true feelings about it, which is, one is that I'm very grateful for it, and seeing working in this mode where I post a comic and then I see an immediate reaction to it, it really keeps me on my toes. Like, I think it's made me a far better cartoonist than if I personally were a newspaper cartoonist, because
Okay.
I see that feedback and I want to play into it, and I want to do better the next time. And so I have a lot of gratitude. And the other side of that is that that is really stressful. It is
Yeah.
really stressful. And like I was talking about earlier, it comes with a lot of responsibility. It's a complicated answer, which is like I'm grateful for it and I think it's made me a better writer, but it also stresses me out.
Oh, I'm sure. It is a complicated issue.
Yeah.
As creators look for finding different venues to interact with fans, where they
Yeah.
can exert greater control over all that noise, right? It's has reducing your availability seemed appealing, or is that,
Mhm.
interaction truly essential to you as a creator at this point?
It depends. Like I said, I can work in both modes, but come like November-ish, I'm gonna start a new book in a different series, and I think I'll be gone for like a year.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to it, because I think sometimes just for me personally, it is better to step away, especially when there's so many things happening and so much tension. Like I think a lot of people might relate to the feeling of being in a fine mood and then logging on and instantly something making you upset or
Yeah.
angry. And I think maybe that component I'm looking forward to just bowing out of for a bit. But I don't want people to interpret it as not having gratitude for my audience, because I really feel like I'm so fortunate to have like a very kind and funny readership.
Yeah.
Um, but I feel like anyone could sort of understand and relate to the fact that being online a lot these days can definitely be a challenge.
So I read Hello Darkness, and
Mhm,
that's the flagship of Oni's relaunch of the sorry, that's Boom Studios.
mhm,
And I read the flagship of Oni's relaunch of the EC line, Epitaphs from the Abyss, in the same evening to get a comparison feel for both. Um, so you just were talking about another project, so you're being pulled in this direction.
mhm,
So first of all, how did you get involved with Hello Darkness
mhm.
at all?
Right. So I've always done horror adjacent work, but never
Okay,
direct horror. So I've done Cryptid Club and Fangs. So I've
right,
written about spooky things,
yeah,
but I've never really tried my hand at horror. And at the beginning of this year, I had just finished Adulthood as a Gift and had some space. And I told my agent, like, just send some emails and see what's out there, see if there's any projects I can jump into. And Hello Darkness came up immediately. And I
okay,
was like, I've wanted to try horror, but been too scared. And so it gave me the opportunity to sort of soft launch and experiment and try it out. And the editor on that project is very encouraging and forgiving. And he was just like, just do whatever feels right. And I was like, okay, this is great because I can sort of just try. And I tried and I was like, I have no idea what it's going to be like to try to write something that's scary. And to my surprise, it wasn't dissimilar from writing a punchline, like
yeah,
a joke, because it
yeah, yeah,
sort of, you have to have the same emotional twist slash hit thing happening. And it has sort of a rhythm to it,
mhm.
and I was surprised at how similar it was. As being funny and being scary are not so far apart, and it really opened something up in me. And so I'll just come out and say it. In November, I'm working on my own collection of horror stories, and I'm
Okay.
gonna do a whole book, and that's gonna be separate from Hello Darkness. Although I have two more stories coming out with Hello Darkness. So it's something that I tried as an experiment and it really just spoke to me. And now I'm going deep into that world.
Is there any reluctance, fear, I'm sure there is, associated with the transition of, okay, Sarah does the funny stuff, now
Hmm.
she's horror stuff. Are you kind of
Hmm.
apprehensive about the audience jumping on board with you?
I
Sorry, I don't mean to
actually,
make it worse.
no, I actually feel kind of optimistic about it because I very much had that feeling when I went from Sarah Scribbles to Fangs,
Okay.
because Fangs is very dark and a lot of the jokes are pretty edgy. And I was like, I don't know if people are going to receive this the same way, but Fangs is actually my bestseller, which surprises a lot of people. But I learned through that when I work in different writing modes, that I can trust my audience and I can trust the intelligence of my audience and the things that they're willing to look at and respond to. And I'm so grateful for that. And so I actually feel optimistic about horror because I feel like my readership with Fangs and Cryptid Club and even some of the Sarah Scribbles comics, they know that I've been like cozying up to horror for a while. So
Okay.
I think the leap isn't too crazy. So I personally feel kind of optimistic.
So you're getting your feet wet, and your Hello Darkness story is called Siren. We won't
Mhm,
give a whole bunch of things away about it,
mhm,
but what when you're getting your feet wet was like, I want to
mhm.
play with a siren. Why did that make
Uh-huh.
sense?
I think I was thinking about fairy tales. So I'm actually German and I was raised with some very dark versions of fairy tales and they're
Okay.
very spooky and creepy. And I wanted to see if I could subvert maybe a trope in one of them. And I also thought a lot about what scares me, and this idea of being watched and stalked by something came up. So it was sort of those two things in combination. And um, Yeah, and I'm really happy with how it came together.
Did you start reading a lot of horror comics to kind of do you normally read a lot of horror comics, you know?
Yeah, I'm a big horror person. I watch tons of horror movies, and I feel like I sort of already had the education
Okay, sure.
just from naturally liking horror. So, yeah. And obviously, uh, I always look at Junji Ito for
Okay.
any horror stuff. You know, he is the king. So, yeah, was definitely going back through my catalogs.
Well, you were talking about it, and when I first interviewed Kyle Starks and a
Mhm,
light bulb moment went off, I just had an absolute epiphany when he talked about that parallel between writing comedy and writing horror.
mhm.
And I'm curious if that is just feels like just a comics specific kind of thing in terms of a medium, because the beats that you were talking about and how you lay things out in comics are very different than you would in like a movie.
Yeah.
So how are you finding that, playing with that?
Yeah. I think that would make a lot of sense because comics, you're so right about a beat and timing
Yeah.
because you really can create timing through comics. And that's something I utilize a lot is the way things flow through time. And horror in comics, I think, is also really dependent on the flow. Like if you're going to have something jump out or scare you, you're going to flip the page. You have to have that kind of musical quality to it. And it's very hard to describe, but when you're writing it, there's definitely a kind of musicality and a timing flow to it that I'm sure exists for like movie directors, but probably in a different way.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Well, before we wrap up, I know you had a
Mhm.
print giveaway that was a part of promoting this book. I
Yeah.
think sadly that's just over as of today.
Yes.
But you've been doing a lot more of Jake Lee prints on your website recently. So tell
Mhm.
me about that, so we can sell some merch and stuff for you.
Yeah, so we're the big things that I'm doing is I'm selling the book and the Giclée prints, and those are all signed. And we do a run every couple of months. The next one is going to be October, so it's going to be a curation of 4 colored and signed Halloween comics, and then the book comes out October 1st. So basically, the next month and a half, I'm just spending building up to that. So if you want to support me as a creator, grab the book and then keep your eye out for the next print run.
Okay. Are those 4 prints going to be? Do people have any advantage signing up for your newsletter? I'm trying to get people to
Mhm.
sign up for your newsletter here. So
Oh, yeah, I appreciate that. Yes, you get early access to the prints
okay.
if you are in the newsletter, and they do sell out. So the early access is definitely a perk.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure to put a link in the show notes so people can sign up for your newsletter. Adulthood as a Gift is available for pre-order wherever you buy your books now. It's coming out beginning of October. It's beginning of October, right?
Yeah, October 1st.
Okay. And your work always puts a smile on my face, Sarah. We all need more laughter in our lives, and there's no better gift than being able to laugh at ourselves. Which is why I can't bear to look at my attempts of TikTok videos. I get plenty of pats on the back, but those are also probably from other Gen Xers like me who are struggling with even trying to relate to millennials, let alone Gen Zers. So this book is excellent as always, and the essays are an absolute standout to me. Such invaluable stuff. And can I just say how brave you are for always putting yourself out there into the world the way you do? I know that kind of thing can be truly inspirational to someone struggling with whatever they're dealing with. And everyone wants to feel seen. So thank you. And thanks for coming on the show again and putting up with me and all my questions. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, please go those pre-orders in, folks. Those additional numbers go a long way to signaling to the publisher that demand will be high, which of course benefits Sarah and all the other creators who are kind of reliant on those sales numbers. So
Yeah.
this is Byron O'Neill, and on behalf of all of us at Comic Book Yeti, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody. This is Byron O'Neill, one of your hosts of the Cryptid Creator Corner, brought to you by Comic Book Yeti. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Please rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. It lets us know how we're doing, and more importantly, how we can improve. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Cryptid Creator Corner, maybe you would enjoy our sister podcast, Into the Comics Cave. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.